We are witnessing a paradigm shift in anime in front of our very eyes. Long gone are the days where all anime would be adapted from Japanese source material. Solo Leveling was an advent of Korean manhwa getting anime adaptations, and my personal favorite is about to receive that very treatment. I'm of course talking about Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint. While I don't necessarily have the highest hopes for that adaptation, considering how most other manhwa adaptations have turned out, I am glad that this amazing story will be getting more attention by the wider community. But just because the country of origin is different, doesn't mean that there aren't same issues in most stories coming out. Whether it be manga or manhwa, the prevalence of power fantasy stories remains unchanged. Naturally, most of these stories turn out to be the same, unoriginal type of story, whether it be reincarnation, regression, tower climb, or any other twist on that same genre. While wading through several of these stories, with most of them not really capturing my attention in any type of way, I discovered ORV. In the beginning, it felt quite similar to many other stories. Where it had amazing art, something that drew me in, the story itself didn't feel like anything special. It was only when I continued reading the story, each chapter drawing me in more than the last, that I realized why I was so enamored with the story. Normally, I don't like to use the word deconstruction to describe a piece of media. It has just become a buzzword for YouTubers to throw around, often without the piece of media being described actually fitting that description. But I feel like it perfectly fits in this case. Not only does it deconstruct several different fantasy genres in spectacular ways, it also explores many other different genres. But the most important aspect of ORV is, without a doubt, its exploration of what it means to be a reader. Kim Dokcha, the protagonist of ORV, is the sole reader of the novel 3 Ways to Survive in a Ruined World. At the start of the story, he reads the final chapter of the over 3,000 chapter long novel, becoming the first and only person to have finished reading the novel in its entirety. Shortly after, the world turns into the world of the novel he has just read. Armed with that knowledge, he works on clearing the so-called scenarios and preventing humanity's downfall. On the surface, this reads like a very standard story. Main character uses knowledge from a novel he's read to beat the bad guy and save the day isn't necessarily the most original concept out there. However, it would be reductive to condense the story into that simple premise. Beyond the gripping story, spanning several different mythologies and narratives, each more intriguing and fascinating than the last, and the fascinating concept surrounding the constellations and the star stream, which we'll get to later, there's an exploration of something that should interest every single one of the novel's readers. Chances are, Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint isn't the first novel you've read, and it very likely won't be the last. We, as readers, consume content at an ever-increasing rate, which makes sense considering the breadth of content released every single year. ORV tagged as a very interesting topic related to that. What are stories? And what does being a reader truly mean? A person having 2 deaths, one when they're buried and another when their memory is forgotten, is a very common viewpoint in mythology and philosophy. But ORV takes that concept a step further. Everything and everyone is made up of stories. They serve as the basis of the human soul and serve as a representation of different places, people, and objects. In fact, the whole story is built on the fact that Constellations want to create stories involving themselves in order to prevent being forgotten, which is the whole reason why these scenarios exist. Even a person's power level directly corresponds to the amount, strength of fables or stories they have collected. This further cements the viewpoint that you are the stories that you experience. By that same token, it makes the main message of the story that much more succinct and impactful. ORV is an amalgamation of several different story types and tropes, but it hits you over the head with the fact that every story is worthwhile and deserves to be read because it may be the most important story in the world for one particular person. If we extend that to saying that all people are stories, then every person, no matter how insignificant they feel, can be important to someone else, even if they don't necessarily feel that way themselves. Kim Doksha was saved by a 3,000 chapter long, boring novel that no one else read, while he, someone who had no social life and no real friends, went on to save the life of countless others. However, while Kim Doksha saved these people in a literal sense, you, as a reader, can do the same in a metaphorical sense. People who have died and have long been forgotten often only be remembered by people who have read or heard about them. You, as the reader, can prevent their second death being forgotten simply by reading and remembering their stories. Going further into it, once you realize that the protagonist, Kim Doksha, is the representation of the reader of a story, some more things start to fall into place. Yo Chung-hyuk represents the protagonist, as he was the main character of the original 3 Ways to Die in a Ruined World. Similarly, the original story represents the story part of a novel. And lastly, we have Han So-young, who represents the author in that metaphorical story. Beyond the surface of the main story, there is a side plot of exploring how these different parts of the novel interact with each other. How is the reader affected by the story? How is the main character affected by being perceived by the reader? How does the author react when a story of his escapes his grasp and takes on a life of its own? All of these questions and more get answered in this novel, and all in a very different and unique way. It takes this novel within a novel concept, runs with it, and doesn't stop at any point. At some points, one of the scenarios involves acting in a story, making it a story within a story within a story. Something that makes this part of the story even more interesting are the constellations themselves. In the beginning, they act and feel as though they were all-powerful beings that just observe humans for fun, not really being affected by anything that happens in a human world. They sort of do stand in as another aspect of the reader. Whereas Kim Doksha represents the very human aspect of what it means to be a reader, how one can be sucked into a story, and how a story can deeply affect a person, the constellations seem to represent more of the objective and detached part of being a reader. In fact, I believe the constellations represent the most interesting aspect the story has to offer. I've previously described them as being a representation of a reader, but maybe comparing them to something like Twitch chatters would be more accurate. From the start, they observe the people participating in the scenarios, give them coins to help them out, or get them to do something. This metaphor is even directly used by the story, as the constellations watch the incarnations through the so-called star streams. In the beginning, these constellations might appear like all-powerful beings, with observing just being one of their whims to pass the time. The characters observed by them definitely seem to think so as well. And while that isn't entirely false, it isn't the whole story either. The constellations do find enjoyment in manipulating incarnations, seeing them do their bidding in whatever way they please. But instead of it being just a way to pass the time for them, it is essential for their existence. Far from being all-powerful beings, constellations are still bound by the same rules of existence as lower beings, with the most important fear of theirs being forgotten, and their inability to directly affect most of the scenarios. Their only way to prevent dying by being forgotten is through the incarnations. Sponsoring the incarnations, leading them through the scenarios, and building up their mythology, or their fable as it's called within the story, is their main way to prevent that. However, apart from being just very interesting philosophically speaking, they also just add so much substance and interest to the story. The way they represent their different mythologies, but not just in their most bog-standard way, makes this story stand out from many of its contemporaries. Be it Korean, Greek, or Christian mythology, you can really notice the author's attention to detail. The way he incorporates all these different mythologies seamlessly within the story, and not only copy and pastes them, but creatively adapts them to fit the framework of his world, is just fantastic. Throughout all my years of reading web novels, Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint is one that has kept me on my toes through all its twists and turns. While it definitely has its hype moments and awesome fights, and those do contribute to my enjoyment of it, those aren't the most important factors of the story, in my opinion. As someone who has read lots and lots of stories, ORV appeals to me in a way that few others do. Its lore is fascinating, and its characters are ones that I love with all my heart. But while those aspects do make me love it, it's the way it tackles the concept of a reader that really spoke to me. Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint is a love letter to everyone who considers himself a reader of any sort. It perfectly encapsulates the feeling of losing yourself in a piece of media, losing hours upon hours, flying through the pages, desperate to get to the next story beat, to the next exciting moment. Post-book depression is something that I'm sure you have all experienced at some points. Empty feeling inside when you finish a story, realizing that it's over and you have to say goodbye to these characters. I've experienced this feeling countless times, and I would even say it's unavoidable once you grow attached to the characters of a story. And ORV is definitely one of the stories where it hit me the hardest. But I'm not saying this to discourage you from reading it. Quite the opposite, in fact. The fact that one can get this attached to these fictional characters is a testament to the author's ability, and I highly recommend the story to anyone who is even slightly interested in it. If you've enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing, liking the video, and even leaving a comment. Thanks for watching.